Daisy.
And I'm Terri.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 215. And this week it is Terri's turn to share something. Terri, what do you have?
Well, Daisy, I don't think I've talked about this podcast before, but maybe I have. I was shocked to learn that I have to pay for this podcast.
Oh, no.
So I need to sort it out within the next 7 days so that I don't buy this one.
Oh, you did the free trial.
Yes. But it's a popular podcast. So it's The Hidden Brain. And the host of the podcast is Shankar Vedantam. And the guest on this episode is one of my favorites, Judson Brewer.
Uh-huh.
And the topic is the Curious Science of Cravings. And in the beginning, I found a different episode where it was Judson Brewer had come back to answer some follow-up questions, which was an interesting episode. But I thought, you know what? I might as well go back and listen to the actual episode that started all of this. And for those who haven't heard me mention him before, he is a psychiatrist. And one of the things I love about him is that he is not someone who just talks about traditional psychiatry and medications. He's very focused on mindfulness and mindfulness-based techniques in learning how to manage anxiety, emotions, and to really work through addictions. So he's the Director of Research and Innovation at the Mindfulness Center and Associate Professor in Behavioral and Social Sciences at Brown University. I first stumbled upon him listening to some podcasts years ago, and the first of his books that I listened to or read at the time, I think I actually maybe read it by holding the book, was called The Craving Mind.
Is he the guy who talks a lot about giving up smoking?
Mm-hmm.
Does he talk about cravings in that realm? Yes, I had a feeling it was him.
Yep. And then he wrote a book called Unwinding Anxiety, which is a great book for anyone working with anxiety. And then he has a new book out now, which at some point I'm going to have to cover it either here or at TFM, but it is called The Hunger Habit.
Oh, yes.
The first one, The Craving Mind, which was the first one I read, as you mentioned, Daisy, the subtitle of it is From Cigarettes to Smartphones to Love, Why We Get Hooked and How We Can Break Bad Habits. And then, like I said, The Unwinding Anxiety, and now The Hunger Habit. So obviously things I'm very interested in and spend a lot of my day working with people addressing all of these things. So I wanted to share some from this episode, The Curious Science of Cravings, and just to kind of think about when we talk about cravings and problematic behaviors and addiction, so much emphasis has been on controlling our desires, cravings, and urges. As Judson Brewer kind of talked about how this had been handled in medicine before, he said basically you would go to your doctor and the old approach was they just make a strong statement to you like smoking is dangerous and you should not smoke and think that you were going to leave their office and be able to stop smoking.
Yeah, that sounds so easy. I can do that.
I was going to say,
why haven't I done it before?
Right. Shockingly, that typically doesn't work. And then the next kind of approach that a lot of people started using was avoidance. And he referred to it as places, people, and things. Basically learning just to avoid these places, avoid these people, or avoid these things. Therefore, I won't use this substance or won't engage in this behavior. The challenge is with so many of our problematic behaviors, they happen so often in so many different contexts that, you basically become a shut-in trying to avoid all of these possible triggers. So obviously that isn't necessarily the best. Now, we may all use that as one part of the strategy. Like, I avoid having problematic foods in my house because I'm much less likely to eat them if they're not here. But I can't rely on that as my only technique. And then he said another very common one that we've all learned is distraction. The problem with distraction is that the desire, the urge, the thought process is kind of always still running in the background. And one of the ways that I've thought about how much that affects me is in my recent quitting of sugar, which we'll have to talk about at some point, that it means that while I'm trying to distract myself or trying to just ignore the urge or the thoughts, the cravings, I'm wasting a lot of energy. I'm using a lot of my internal resources to do that distracting or these other things. So probably not, again, the most effective tool. And then the one that we're probably all most familiar with is willpower.
Oh, yeah.
If you just resist it, you're going to overpower it and it'll be gone. Judson Brewer brings up at this point that this is so not a useful strategy. He says that there's a science term for abstinence violation effect. Basically, once you then do open the floodgates to this substance or this behavior, the floodgates open, you do it even more problematic. And then the resulting guilt and shame, which of course just leads to more engagement with this behavior. So leaning on willpower is not really effective either. So in his early work, he was working a lot with patients around addiction. So as you mentioned, a lot of smoking cessation, probably one of his early things that he gained kind of notoriety for. A lot of substance abuse, and then also eating. This episode talked more about the eating kinds of cravings, but he talks about things, obviously, I can't get off social media, or, these behaviors are getting in the way for me. But this one was a little bit more about food. So earlier on in his career, he was working with a group of women with binge eating disorder. And at the time, his worst problematic eating was he would eat too many gummy worms. He was kind of addicted to gummy worms. So he really just didn't understand this binge eating disorder. And just based on, as you kind of get to know him, as you listen to him and read him, he's just this really nice, kind guy. And he really wanted to understand rather than just come on from Mount High as the expert, just do this. He really wanted to understand. And so he really started to ask them about their urges and what triggers this response. And, he learned a lot. All kinds of things triggered it. It's raining. It's too sunny. I'm angry. I'm happy. All of these things that could trigger this urge to binge. And they then really started sharing about their cravings being caused by so many things that he then referred to as hedonic hunger. That emotional hunger was driving them to eat problematically. It wasn't physiological hunger, but it was this seeking of relief, the seeking of pleasure, the seeking of comfort. So he and the hosts of the show started talking about how, being hungry, the physiological need for food is natural, but where most of us struggle is that it becomes layered upon layered with these emotional drives. And as you and I have talked about, and everyone in the TFM community knows, we talk about this a lot of, it becomes an emotional management system. And he talked about one of his patients early on in this work who referred to these urges, and she kind of gave it a character, and it was the craving monster. He said if we thought about it as this other thing, this craving monster, and then we could just really become objective and look at it and observe what's happening. It's kind of like it's a puppeteer that's pulling the strings or moving the strings that cause these behaviors. What he learned in working with her and other people on these challenges that they were facing is that if you actually pay attention and really get into that mindfulness place and pay attention what's happening while you're engaging the behavior. What does it feel like? What are the thoughts? What does it feel like when you eat that, or when you smoke that cigarette, or place that gambling bet? If you really get good at paying attention, that you can notice things about it that aren't as pleasing as what is motivating you to do it. So we then had a patient that came in to quit smoking. And one of the things that I found really interesting when I first started reading Judson Brewer's work is that he does really focus on this mindfulness, becoming very aware of the impact of what you're doing as you're doing it. And he said basically to this guy, look, you're going to keep smoking. That's fine. But because you're going to smoke, what I want you to do is pay attention while you're smoking. I want you to notice what it feels like when you get started. I want you to pay attention. What does it taste like when you smoke?
Smoke mindfully.
Yeah. Said no one ever. But, what does your breath smell like afterward? What does your hair smell like? What do your clothes smell like? How do you feel? All of these things to become really mindful. He also helped the man to recognize, look, you've been smoking for a long time now. How many cigarettes do you smoke a day? How long have you been smoking? So they did the little math equation. So basically he, affirmed for this gentleman, look, you have smoked probably around 293,000 times.
Wow.
So this has been very well entrenched behavior. So I'm not surprised that you're not going to stop tomorrow. Let's look at how we can make this happen. And I think this is an important part for many of us to really look at. These are long-lived patterns, things that we've learned to do. And they've been, you and I have talked about how many times do you have to change your behavior or a thought to make it different. Think about it. If I've done this one thing over 290,000 times, I shouldn't be surprised that the first week I don't just snap out of it and start doing it differently. So I think that was an important piece for me as I was listening. He then also talked about using a strategy that he calls kind curiosity. He talked about making kindness and curiosity best friends. That if you're going to be curious about your behaviors and look at them, what most of us have learned to do is that we've fallen into this habit of seeing our behaviors through a judgmental lens.
Yeah, that was the word that came straight to my mind. Yeah.
I shouldn't be doing this. I'm weak if I do this. I'm stupid. I'm lazy. I'm whatever. And we get frustrated with ourselves. And he said, the more we can get curious and be kind about it, the more we can learn. And then that awareness is really going to help us. And I actually thought about you, Daisy, when I was listening to this part. He talked about with his patients, he would often, if they were parents, he would often talk about, okay, so if your 8-month-old is screaming bloody murder, what are you going to do? And the first response is always like, well, I need to make them stop because this is hurting my ears and this is so annoying. But it's really focused on you and your response versus why is the child screaming? And if you get curious, what does the screaming child need? And it made me think of you and your dog training that you've been doing. That if you can look at what goal is the dog trying to achieve, what need are they trying to meet versus what do you want them to do?
Yeah.
It changes it so much. So getting curious and really understanding what are the needs that we're meeting through this craving, this behavior. So he had this client or his patient come in one day who was smoking and wanted to quit smoking. And he said, Dr. Brewer, if I don't smoke right now, my head is going to explode. A little bit hyperbolic, but this intensity of the craving and this urge just was so overwhelming. And so he asked the gentleman to just talk through it with him and describe, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? What's happening in your body right now? And what happened is, as the man was describing all of this, the intensity of the urge eventually started to decrease. The urge lessened. And the light bulb kind of goes on over his head. And the patient realized that the cravings were made up of thoughts and emotions. And if he could pay attention to his thoughts and emotions, the intensity of the craving went down. And so Judson Brewer talks about, this being the observer effect. By observing our thoughts, we can't really be identified with them when we go from that observer role. And I know you and I've touched on this in other episodes.
It's giving that little bit of a distance.
That's right.
The gap. Isn't that referred to as a something gap, the thinking gap or something like that? Haven't we mentioned that somewhere? Yeah, it's just that gap between, isn't it? Gives you a bit of breathing space.
Absolutely. And so when you're not consumed by it because you're not in it so much, then this gentleman could be more aware of what was happening and what he was experienced rather than having to do something like resist or distract himself or smoke. So this awareness is so important that if I can be present with what I'm experiencing, focus on that, the need to act on the craving diminishes significantly. So he started studying this in his lab with people and really looking at if he could use this mindfulness, this awareness approach versus kind of standard treatments of how to deal with cravings. What he found is that they had a 5% greater quit rate than the gold standard of treatment.
Wow.
So more cognitive behavioral type treatments for these things. So really had some validating outcomes to show that being mindful really could change the pattern of these urges and acting on the urges more so than most other forms of treatment that had been in existence before then. So he then talked about, as we think about overcoming our urges and our cravings, what we really want to do is we want to leverage the strength of our brain. Our brain is an amazing thing, and it can be used for good or for evil. So if you think about this principle that our brain will keep doing things that are rewarding and will stop doing things that are not rewarding. Now, in the Q&A episode, this woman asked about, why is it that I keep doing things that don't pay off? Why do I keep doing these things that are harmful to me or whatnot? Or, this idea of they feel good in the moment, but I know they're giving me negative consequences in the future. And he pointed this out in that point. And I think this is important for all of us. Our brain is not designed for future survival. Our brain is designed for right now survival. So that delayed gratification, that thinking about future payoffs is much more complicated for the brain. But going back to this concept, the brain will do what is rewarding and it will stop doing what is not rewarding. So we need to work on that part. So the only variable really needed is awareness. And if you pay attention to what's going on, so again, with the smoking or with the eating of this food, you're basically going to get an error message when it's not rewarding. It's going to start telling your brain to stop doing the behavior because you're not getting the reward. And he referred to this as you want to develop disenchantment. You want to be disenchanted with that cigarette. You want to be disenchanted with those cookies. But you have to be mindfully present to create that awareness. And I thought this was interesting. He said typically it only takes 10 to 15 times of going through this to really drop that reward value of something to zero.
Really? Wow.
So if you're doing this active mindfulness, paying attention, you don't have to do the new behavior 10,000 times before it takes. You just need to drop the reward value on this old pattern.
Because how many times do people say that? I couldn't help myself. I couldn't stop myself from eating whatever it was or doing whatever it was. It's like, that part of my brain takes over.
That's right.
So he's tapping into that, isn't he?
Because it's getting rewarded.
Yeah.
Doing the behavior is somehow reinforcing it's getting rewarded. But if your brain stops getting rewarded with it, it will drop that behavior.
Yeah, because it's actually hiding from you at the time. So all the bad stuff that's going on, that's what he's trying to tap you into being mindful about, actually, some of the negative things that are happening in the moment.
That's right. So his example with his gummy worms, he was, basically addicted to gummy worms, is that he started practicing this and he would put one in his mouth and it was like, wow, this is the weirdest slimy texture. And oh my gosh, that sweetness is it's like chemically based. Oh, And suddenly he didn't want gummy worms because they no longer held that high reward value for him, because he was paying attention to the things that were not rewarding. So they lost their value. Then the next step from there is the more you pay attention, and just what you just highlighted, Daisy, and paying attention to the things that are not rewarding, but your brain still wants to have something that's rewarding, that what you will end up doing is start to find what he calls bigger and better alternatives. So in this example for him, and he got pretty giddy when they were talking about this during the episode, blueberries. He talked about how they taste, the texture, like this is just like the bigger, better thing. But he still had this sweet response, like what he was going to the gummy worms for, without all those negatives. And they didn't create additional cravings. They were satisfied. He got that sweet thing. It was actually met, and he could stop. He doesn't eat bags and bags and bags of blueberries like he would with the gummy worms. So going back to the food examples, he goes back to this one patient that he had worked with who talked about the craving monster. And she had an old pattern of, after spending time with her mother, it was a very stressful relationship. And she would often go to the store and buy a lot of problematic foods and just kind of gorge on these foods. And so she decided, while she was sitting in the parking lot, to bring the craving monster in with her and have it come into the car with her and kind of think about what was happening. And she just allowed herself to think about those cravings. And, what if I get this food? What will that feel like? What will my stomach feel like when I eat that? What will I feel like then? And she then went into the grocery store, and she came out and she had bought, I think, avocados and olives. And normally she would have gone in and gotten all of this other stuff. But she realized, by asking herself, how will I feel if I eat this? And she just kind of walked it through in her mind. She knew she wasn't going to feel well. It lost its reward value. Whereas before, sitting there in the parking lot, all she could think about is how great it was going to be when she got that food. And as you and I have talked about, that's where the dopamine hit really comes in, with the anticipation. But when she really started kind of killing that with, it's really not going to feel very good, she went in and she got something that was actually satiating for her body and had broken that pattern. So I was just thinking about this. And like I said, we talk about this all the time at the fasting method. But I think a lot of our listeners here who aren't maybe also in the fasting method may be interested in thinking more about how their cravings kind of drive these behaviors, and that there really are ways to address it without just, going the Odysseus route and having someone tie you to the mast of your ship so that you don't give in to temptation. That by decreasing the reward value in the problematic behaviors, the problematic foods, the problematic substances, whatever it is for you, and doing that through this mindfulness piece, that you can let go of a lot of problematic things without having to suffer through the guilt and shame or torture of the process. And if you listen to him talk about it, in some of these examples I shared, after the people were really working through this, almost engaging in the old behavior was more torturous than not engaging in that behavior. Like, smoking a cigarette was so disgusting to that gentleman then that he didn't want to do it anymore. Eating gummy worms to Dr. Brewer was almost repulsive. And you find the bigger, better alternative, something that is satisfying. And hopefully for most of us, that isn't always a different food item, but finding something that actually meets the need that craving was based on. And for many of us, it's an emotional need. It's an emotional craving. I'm bored. I'm lonely. I'm angry. I'm hurt. I'm sad. I'm afraid, whatever it may be. So I just thought maybe our listeners might enjoy checking into some Judson Brewer work and thinking about their cravings and how they manage those.
Yeah, I like him. I really like his approach. I like, what you were saying about him really wanting to understand those women with the binge eating disorder, with his just overall, you mentioned this kind curiosity, but I think that's kind is a good word to associate with him. That does seem to be his perspective. It comes from that. Yeah, let's be kind. Let's be kind to ourselves. Let's be kind to my clients when I'm working with them.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, that kind of approach rather than dictating, rather than bullying, whatever it is, all these things that we know won't work. And that when you were talking about the woman going into the grocery store, I've done that. And sometimes that other part of my brain does win out and I do end up buying the things that I was anticipating. But more often than not these days, I will have that conversation. Like, oh, just hold on a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Hold on a minute. Just remember how you feel after you've had those things. And we've talked about the hot cross buns and the mince pies and all these things that gradually, bit by bit, that voice has become stronger in my head.
Mm-hmm.
And it does take some time and it does take some repetition, but you do get to the point where it's strong enough that it's just becomes easier every time you're walking past. And of course they have the big displays when it's Easter, or the big displays of mince pies when it's Christmas, and they put them where you can't help but see them when you come into the supermarket, so it's always there. And especially if you go in a low ebb and you're like, oh, really tempted to reach out, but no, that voice, the more often you let it come in and the more mindful you are, the stronger it becomes, but not in a judgmental way.
Mm-hmm.
Just remember, you can still make that choice if you want to, but let's just remind ourselves.
That's right.
How crappy you're going to feel.
Which is kind of funny. I was just thinking about almost the opposite of, gosh, in what ways do we use this part of our brain a little differently? Like, I never, ever, ever want to do my taxes when it's time to do my taxes because all I remember is how I don't like how I feel when I'm doing my taxes. I don't like gathering the materials. I don't like having to get the right thing online to do this and do that. I don't like looking at the numbers. I don't like not being a multimillionaire with my money, So I don't think about doing taxes on a regular basis. There's not a big reward value, except I don't want to go to prison. But this thing about the reason I don't want to do them is because I'm so in touch with what is not pleasing about them. Mm-hmm. I don't like how I feel when I'm doing my taxes. Therefore, I don't look forward to doing it. I don't want to do it more often. But what many of us have learned, as you kind of highlighted, when it comes to things we want, things that we enjoy, that's all we focus on. Oh my gosh, it feels so good when I do that. And we ignore the 10 negative ways we feel when we do it. It's almost like we block that out. And our brain does have that ability. I used this example this morning with a client that, the way I understand it, I could be wrong, but when women are in childbirth, in part of the medication that is given to them, the pain blocker, there is a little bit of an amnesia-causing medication in there.
Oh, really? Handy.
Because if anyone focused on how horrible they felt at that time, they would never have a second child. They would never have 4, but it's blocked. Mm. And so think about it. We have kind of learned to block those unpleasant experiences based on things that we want. And we focus on the kind of romanticized, oh my gosh, this food's going to taste so good, or this cigarette, it's going to feel so good to have this relief right now. But if instead I pay attention to what that smoke smells like coming out of my mouth, or, I don't want to do that so much. So I love his approach too, Daisy. And as you said, he is just kind man. He has this nice little laugh that he does often when he's telling stories. Just very, very positive kind of person. So I always enjoy listening to him as well. And I think his work is amazing.
Yeah, it's funny. I've told the story many times before, so I'm not going to tell it again. But just to highlight that being mindful about how you feel when you're doing something, especially if it's something, tackling an addiction of some kind. Of that time, when I was eating the tubs and tubs of ice cream with tears streaming down my face. I mean, obviously with hindsight, but in the moment, it just goes to show how your brain can, no, keep doing that, keep doing that, keep doing that. Mm-hmm. But if that mindful part could kick in and say, and the kind mindful part kick in and say, whoa, hold on a minute. You're in floods of tears. This is not making you feel good. Mm-hmm. Let's see if we can find. And I like that, the importance of that last step, finding the bigger, better thing. Mm-hmm. Finding, something that once you've dealt with that, something that you can replace it with.
Yeah.
Something else. I think that's an important step that we probably often forget, because there's going to be a part of your brain that's like, well, you've taken something away. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of nice to give something back.
And I think the way you just described it kind of sparked a thought in my mind is, I think oftentimes we're looking for, that was a reward, I'm going to replace it with a different reward. Mm. And I think instead, the way you said it reminded me more, I was meeting some kind of need with that, not successfully. So I'm going to actually allow myself to find another way to meet that need. So it doesn't mean I'm going to substitute this food for that food or this substance for that substance, but rather I'm going to let myself explore what is the need that I now can feel rewarded by meeting. So much power.
Yeah. And I think how you feel about something, and just going to round off by bringing it back to dog training because you mentioned it. But what I think the key part of the kind of training approach that I follow is the key to changing the behavior. So getting the dog to, drop a behavior or adopt a new behavior that you want them to. The key is getting them to feel differently about it. Mm-hmm. So trying to tackle Lila's reactivity, which is basically her telling me that she's scared about something, is getting her to feel differently about those triggers. And that's what he's saying, isn't it? If you can feel differently, whether it's being mindful about the negative aspects or replacing it with something that actually meets those needs, it is the changing the way you feel about something.
Yeah, I wish I could think of how they said it in the episode, but they highlighted something right in line with what you're saying, that if we learned to let how we feel about something, and I don't just mean feelings, but even physiological, what we feel with it, that has so much more power than just what we think. But we're taught to problem solve with thinking and think our way out of things versus feel and pay attention to what we're actually experiencing in our body. Yeah, I think that's a great example, Daisy. See, look at Lila. She is coming up as great examples for us.
Definitely. Well, yes, you've inspired me to go back and listen to some more Judson Brewer. You've reminded me how he's a great person to listen to. So I shall be doing that.
Very good.
Thank you very much.
Very good.
In the meantime, I hope you and everyone at home has a very wonderful week.
Take good care, everybody. He then started studying this in his lab. This is funny because in my notes I wrote, study published in 3011. No.
Impressive.
Way to go, Judd.